A lot of economics is about the state or the government. Macroeconomics is almost entirely about government policy. Even if some economists might say that it is ineffective, it's about that. Lots of other things, international trade, innovation, labor market, inequality. Of course, not everything about those topics relate to government policy, but even if you are studying an aspect that is not directly related to government policy, they have policy implications. And even esoteric theoretical debate about human nature, human motivation, the cognitive process, they have an effect on how you formulate your government policy. And I think the best example we saw in this, the Brexit debate.
That claim on the side of the bus.
Mainstream economists, most of whom were supporting Remain, that the UK stays in the European Union, basically had this assumption that people are entirely motivated by monetary gains or losses. So they thought it was enough to scare people with things like this. If you exit the European Union, you'll be £4,300 worth of. Even if you accept that this was somehow correct estimate, this policy approach was entirely based on this assumption that people basically act according to their wallet. And there was no even inkling to many economists that people care about things like sovereignty or sense of national identity, hostility towards strange people like myself. These are realities. You cannot just assume that economic theory says people don't care about anything other than money, and let's run with this. No wonder they lost the referendum. So in all countries that are not in a state of anarchy, the government is the single most important economic actor by a huge margin. So for example, as you can see from this graph, governments in the rich countries are huge. They consume for themselves, they invest, but they also collect taxes and transfer money across different groups through the welfare regime. These together account for somewhere between 30 and 57% of GDP. However, that is considerable variation. You have in countries like Finland, France, Denmark, you have a government accounting for well over 50% of GDP. Switzerland, Australia, United States, Japan, these tend to have smaller governments. Developing countries have much smaller governments. Their governments tend to account for about 15 to 25% of GDP typically, although in some countries it could be below 10%. Even most of these governments are actually considerably larger than their counterparts in the earlier days of capitalism. This is historical statistics of the size of government. It starts in the 1880s. At the time, the biggest government was the French one, which accounted for between 15 and 17% of GDP. So even that was in the lower range of distribution of size of government in developing countries today. And when it came to countries like the United States or Japan, the government was tiny. The Japanese government was barely accounting for 1% of GDP. The American one was 2 to 3%, the Swedish one 6 to 7%. So actually, you can see that historically the government has grown much bigger. Well, basically, over time, people have figured out that markets have a lot of problems and shortcomings, and basically decided that we need public policy to address many of these. Anyway, in all countries, the government is by far the single largest employer. For example, in the UK, the biggest private sector employer is Tesco, the supermarket chain. It hires over 400,000 people, but that's only about 1.5% of entire labor force of the UK. The UK government employs 17% of the labor force. Similarly, in the United States, the biggest private sector employer is Walmart, the supermarket chain, and they employ just over 1% of US labor force. The US federal government, despite being a relatively small government, hires at 70% of the labor force. Yeah, in some countries like Denmark, something like 35% of the labor force is hired by the government. In poor countries, the picture is quite different. Their government is much smaller, so they employ usually between 7 and 12% of the labor force. But even so, this will make any government the largest single employer in any country. Most governments own state-owned enterprises that produce a huge range of things, steel, airline services, banking, paper, you name it. On average, 10% of the world output is produced by state-owned enterprises, which is quite a significant figure. In some countries, it's much bigger. It's 16% in Taiwan, 22% in Singapore. United States, state-owned enterprise could be producing only around 1 or 2% of GDP. The government also affects the way private sector agents behave through various means. So first of all, you can ban things. You can ban, say, child labor or slave labor. You can ban certain substances like the CFC gas or asbestos or growth hormone in cows, which, by the way, is allowed in the US, not in the EU. So there's a lot of concern about that after Brexit, when and if the UK signs a free trade agreement with the US. The government also uses regulations to mandate certain types of behavior, ranging from big things like the requirement to use low carbon energy to relatively small but important things like requiring that workers are given adequate breaks during their working hours. Government uses taxes, sometimes actually to encourage certain things, because for example, when a government imposes an import tariff, it's actually encouraging domestic production of the taxed item. But usually taxes are used to discourage things like carbon taxes or airplane fuel taxes to discourage flying or carbon generating economic activities. Of course, government also uses subsidies to encourage certain things like research and development, or installing of solar panels at homes. So in addition to actually spending money, the government does a lot of things to influence the way the people behave. And of course, in order to do all this, the government needs to buy lots of inputs, ranging from nuclear reactors, if it owns electricity industry, to pencils that people use in offices. And this procurement can be quite large. In the Netherlands, this is equivalent to 20% of GDP. Regardless of the content, the sheer size of the government means that if it increases spending, there is a boost to the economy. If it cuts spending, there's a dampening of the economy. Today, the government is so important in our economy, you have to really take it very seriously. These days, the most common way of framing the discussion on the role of the state is, of course, around the idea of market failure. In the core classical and neoclassical theories, rational individuals seeking their self-interest in markets are supposed to produce socially optimal outcomes, the idea of so-called invisible hand. The market failure approach, first developed by Arthur Pigott, who was a neoclassical economist in the 1920s, argues that there are cases where this is not true. Rational, selfish individuals acting in their own self-interest can actually produce socially suboptimal outcomes. Then it is justified for the government to intervene to change the situation. So that was the logic of the so-called market failure approach, or welfare economics, as it is also known. The most widely accepted example of market failure is the case of public goods. In economics, a good is called a public good if those who have not paid for it can consume it. So, for example, you build a road, and those who haven't paid for it can drive on it. So when you have the goods like this, you have a problem of providing it through the market, because car owners will think, well, that if someone builds the road, I can use it, so why should I pay for it? Now the problem is that everyone thinks like this and tries to free ride on the others. There'll be no money to build this road. So economists have argued that in this kind of situation, the best way to provide these public goods is for the government to collect taxes from every potential user and just build it and let people use it. So a lot of things have been provided by the government for this reason. Basically what people collectively call the infrastructure is the best example. Road, bridges, lighthouses, flood defense system, and what have you. Also things like law and order, military defense. These are cited as cases of public goods. But note that there are relatively few goods that are genuine public goods, because you can exclude people from using these things. You go to France, you go to Switzerland, you go to South Korea, there are toll booths for main highways. Today they say that there are radio signal technologies that can replace lighthouses. And then you jam the signal and give the kind of unjamming code only to people who pay for it. So there's no light, but you can navigate that with radio signal. If you haven't paid for the radio signal, you don't get it. Of course, there are things that have to be publicly provided. Military defense is an example. You cannot fight a battle in a way that excludes non-payers. You cannot fight a street battle and tell your soldiers, no, don't defend flat number 73. They forgot to pay the defense tax. So there are some things that are genuinely public goods. There's no way that you can provide it through market mechanism, but actually there are a lot of other things which are routinely provided by the government under the approval from many economists that actually are not really public goods. The fact that a lot of so-called public goods are not really public goods in the economic sense shows how the boundary between the market and the government is drawn for political reasons rather than for purely theoretical reasons. Another classic case of market failure is externality. This is actually the origin of market failure approach. Because that's what Pigou talked about. Pollution is a classic case of negative externality. So you have a, say, factory that uses lots of chemicals upriver, and chemicals are discharged into the river, and then the fish farmers down the stream suffer because the water quality falls and their fish do not grow well or die. As for positive externality, the most frequently used example is research and development or training that firms conduct. So when a firm conducts research and development, of course, some of the technologies can be appropriated fully by taking out a patent on it. But sometimes this is not possible. And then other people see what you do and then get knowledge and then increase their productivity. Or when you train your workers, other firms can poach the worker, but then in these cases, there's no way you can, as the firm doing these things, generating positive externality, demand the other firms to pay you. So in order to address externality, economists have recommended the government can take a few course of actions. First of all, it can supply goods with positive externality itself. This is why a lot of government have public research institutes. Governments that recognize that if you left it to the private sector, not enough that research with positive externality will be done. Government also provide education and health in the belief that these things create positive externality. Or government may subsidize those who are creating positive externalities. A lot of governments that give R&D subsidies. They give subsidies to the firms for training their workers, and so on. Conversely, the government can impose regulation or taxes to discourage behaviors that generate negative externalities. Control on pollution is a classic example. In neoclassical economics, it is said that when there is monopoly or oligopoly, namely only one firm or very few firms that are supplying the goods and services, there is imperfect competition. And imperfect competition is a case of market failure in neoclassical economics. Basically, in a market with a lot of competitors, when you have perfect competition, producers do not have the freedom to set the price. They are price takers, not price makers, as a rival can always undercut them. In contrast, monopolist or oligopolist firms have what economists call market power. Basically, they can set their prices by adjusting the quantity that they produce. So by producing less, they drive up the price. So according to neoclassical theory, a firm with market power will produce at the level of output that maximizes its profit, which is less than the socially optimal level. As a result, an amount of resource known as the deadweight loss is lost to the society as the firm is producing less than what it could be, because in the situations of perfect competition, it will be willing to produce up to the point where it doesn't make loss. Now it produces less and increases its profit, so that output is lost. It also is a loss to the society because it means that the firm now fails to serve those customers who are willing to pay more than the minimum, the level where the firm doesn't make a loss, but who are unwilling to pay the now higher monopolistic price. So a lot of governments have tried to address this problem of monopolies. The most drastic measure against them is to break these firms up. Actually, it once happened that in 1984, the American government broke up the AT&T, the telephone and telegraph company, into 7 smaller companies. Today, people talk of breaking up Facebook or Google. So, this is on the card. More typically, the government uses regulations to keep the prices as close as possible to the level that would have prevailed under perfect competition. So a lot of governments impose price regulations on monopolies and oligopolies. And, things like electricity, gas, and so on is a typical example. Also, the government can prevent firms from colluding with each other to set prices at a higher level. This is unlikely if there are lots of firms, but in oligopolistic market, if you have 3 or 4 firms that they can, even without formally forming a cartel, which a lot of companies used to do in the early 20th century, they can collude in setting prices. So somehow, price by, South African Airways, British Airways, Virgin Atlantic, going to Cape Town are almost identical. So there was actually a legal case against these airlines. Certain schools of economics, like the Schumpeterian school and the Austrian school, actually denounce this idea of perfect competition. They actually say that this is a state of economic stasis where there is no innovation. Schumpeter is known as an economist who basically brought this idea of innovation into economics. So Schumpeter argued that firms can compete through prices. They can try to cut prices to drive out the competitors. In order to cut prices, they need to improve efficiency. But this is nothing compared to competition through technological innovation. Schumpeter actually said that if price competition is like forcing a door, competition through innovation is like aerial bombardment. There's no comparison. Because when someone invents a totally new product, totally new technology to produce that an existing product, then the competitive landscape completely changes. Now, according to his theory, when firms innovate, the firm for a period becomes basically a monopoly, during which it can charge anything, because it's the only firm that can produce certain thing, and then people will basically pay an arm and a leg to get it. Of course, over time, other firms imitate this new firm. They begin to produce similar things and sometimes even better things, and the original firm loses its position as the monopolist, but then sometime later someone else might come up with new technology, and he said that this is how capitalism develops. So when something new is created, it destroys a lot of things, but then that takes the economy to another level, or higher level. So people who follow Schumpeter, and also the people who have a similar idea to Schumpeter, like the Austrians in this respect, argue that this means that the government shouldn't try to clamp down on monopolies. Because after all, monopoly profit is the incentive for innovation. So if firms know that as soon as you become a monopoly, the government will come down on you, why should they innovate? In the long run, no monopolies are secure. There's a famous story in a congressional hearing in the late 1950s. The then CEO of IBM was asked, what is your projection about the computer market? How big is it going to be? And his answer was, in the foreseeable future, the total demand will be 5. No, because at that time, the computers were as big as a room, so expensive, only like the Pentagon and the US Army and US Navy and so on were able to buy it. So it was the only firm producing computers. Now IBM doesn't even exist as a computer company. Basically, the manufacturing has been sold to the Chinese company Lenovo, and IBM now exists as a consulting company. Hoover, it was so dominant that Hoover became the name for vacuum cleaner, at least in Britain. So today, a lot of people hoover their houses with a Dyson vacuum cleaner. In the 1980s, we used to Xerox things. We didn't photocopy things, because that was the photocopier company. I mean, today, a lot of these companies have disappeared or either pushed out of that particular segment of the business. RCA, the American TV company, was like the company that almost single-handedly invented color TV. When it went bankrupt, a big chunk of it was bought by the South Korean electronics giant LG, which used to be like the lowest subcontractor for RCA. Yeah, so in this bigger scheme of things, give it 50 years, give it 30 years, no monopolies are secure. Well, I have, with this example of monopolies, just pointed out that the same market dominated by a monopoly can be seen as a most successful one by one school of economics, that is the Schumpeterian school, and seen as a case of market failure by another school of economics, that is neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economists will say free trade is good for everyone. The so-called developmentalist school of Alexander Hamilton, Friedrich List, Albert Hirschman, these people will say, no, free trade actually prevents developing countries from industrializing. Neoclassical economists believe that free market will more or less generate full employment. Keynesians think free market is structurally unable to generate full employment. Neoclassical economists believe that financial markets are in general efficient and stable. Keynesians and behavioralists will argue that it is inefficient and prone to crisis. So if different economic theories have different views on how markets work or fail to work, we cannot make a balanced judgment on the role of the state without knowing a whole range of economic theories. Hence the pluralist approach to economics that we are taking in this series of lectures. The fact that a market is failing doesn't necessarily mean that we will be better off with government intervention. The so-called government failure school or the public choice theory that came to prominence since the 1980s have argued that, look, in the same way that real-world markets are not as ideal as textbook markets, real-world governments are also imperfect. So they argue that the market failure approach basically assumes that the real-world governments are modern equivalent to Plato's philosopher king, all-knowing, benevolent, all-powerful. It will just sort out all the problems. The government failure argument basically points out that you need to think about the intention and the ability of the government before you can recommend government intervention, even if there's a market failure. A government may not even want to implement right policies that improve social welfare, even if it could. I mean, in market failure approach, there's this assumption that the government wants to make the society better, but then it may not be the case. Well, actually, the insight is not new. I mean, the Marxist school of economics have always argued that the state in a capitalist society will basically act in the interest of the capitalist class, not for general social welfare, not to speak of workers' interests. So in some countries, you have dictators. I mean, there is very easy to see. These dictators basically run the country for their own, at most their own family's welfare, rather than general social welfare. Even in democracies, politicians may implement policies that increase the chance of their election rather than serving general interest. So you could, announce a lot of spending programs that will attract votes, but then these programs in the long run might create budget deficit, inflation, balance of payment problems, and downgrading of sovereign credit rating. Whether they work under a dictatorship or democracy, bureaucrats will design policies in a way that serves their interests. So there's this particular group of theory called the budget maximizing bureaucrat approach, invented by this American economist Niskanen, who used to be one of the advisors to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, which basically says that the goal of the bureaucracy is to increase its budget rather than serving general interest. And last but not least, a lot of policies are results of lobbying by interest groups. So bankers are lobbying for more lenient financial regulation, industrialists asking for increased trade protection, trade unions pushing for higher minimum wages, what have you. These policies may serve the interests of the group that these lobbyists represent, but may be negative for the greater society. In addition to the problem of intentions, there's a problem of ability. because the government may lack the information to make intelligent intervention. The government does not know about the affairs of the subjects of its policy as much as the subjects themselves know. So say that there's an industry that has been getting tariff protection on the ground of infant industry protection. And then it hasn't done well. And then the representatives of the industry will argue that no, this is purely because of bad luck. You had financial crisis some years ago. There was Chinese competition or whatever. It's not our fault. You have to extend this intervention. The truth might have been that these guys were lazy. They may have been just having a kind of easy life behind the walls of protection. But then the government cannot really know fully what these guys have done or not done to increase productivity while they are getting the protection, i.e. whether they have been making efforts to grow up. So without that information, the government will have to buy this story. Essentially, that what economists call asymmetric information problem in conducting state intervention. There's also the resource problem because the policies do not implement themselves. If you want to implement a policy, you need lots of resources. You need people to do it. Sometimes you need to buy certain things. Sometimes you need to create a certain infrastructure. For example, if you want to implement intellectual property right laws, that you need to create a whole system of intellectual property right protection, because you need to, for example, create a patent court. You need to train people to become patent lawyers, patent examiners. You need to hire, say, the inspectors to catch people making pirate the DVDs or CDs. These are costly. So the advocates of the government failure approach argue that, especially in developing countries where they lack human and financial resources, the government should basically refrain from intervention. Because even if the policy looks good on paper, it cannot be implemented because of the lack of resource. So when the intention and the ability of the government are suspect, the proponents of the government failure argument emphasize letting the government intervene in the name of correcting for market failure may actually make things worse. Yes, markets fail, but governments fail even more. The main solution offered by the government failure approach, they recommend depoliticization of the economy. First of all, government is shrunk, so cut government spending, privatize state-owned enterprises, deregulate markets so that government doesn't have these levers to make mischief. Of course, there are still some areas where you cannot get rid of the government, like the management of national currency, the collection of taxes, or the regulation of natural monopolies like water, gas, electricity. But in those areas, they argue that we need to basically create these agencies with political independence. In those remaining few areas where politicians still have a say, like the budget and national debt and so on, we have to restrict their freedom of action through legislation. So a lot of countries have balanced budget law. A lot of countries have introduced ceilings on national debt. So that way, politicians cannot really do a lot to determine the course of the economy. Now, this sounds like a great proposal in an age of deep mistrust of politicians and government officials. Politics has become such a dirty word in the last few decades. People get into political offices by pretending that they are not politicians. Yeah, but if they are not politicians, why do they want to become presidents and the MPs? This is crazy when you think about it. I mean, already back in 2000, when George W. Bush and Al Gore were running against each other for the presidency of the United States of America, I came across this report on a poll in the Financial Times. This poll did one interesting thing. It asked people, why do you not support the other guy? And the answer that got the most yeses was, he's too political. No, give me a break. I mean, these people are running for the biggest political office in the world, and you want amateurs? Yeah? So given this general atmosphere, I think that a lot of people find this idea of depoliticizing the economy by shrinking the state, constraining its autonomy, and creating a lot of autonomous agencies. But I think that this proposal has a serious problem. Basically, markets are run according to $1, one vote rule, and democracies are run according to one person, one vote rule. So if you say that you want to constrain politics, it basically implies that you want to give more power to people with more money. The starting point of this government failure argument was that everyone is selfish. Everyone is out to advance his or her own interests, whether they are in marketplaces haggling or whether they are working in the Whitehall. But then why do you think this particular group of so-called technocrats like central bankers and utility regulators are such special people that they can be given power? Why should they have the autonomy that you so dearly want to take away from politicians and other government officials? Government failure, of course, does exist. We have to take it seriously. But I think the proponents of the government failure argument vastly exaggerate the extent of government failure, because in real life, there are lots of governments that work quite well and some work quite excellently. The reason is, in a way, simple, because people are not what they are assumed to be in the theory of government failure. There are lots of politicians striving to promote national interests rather than their electoral chances. Many bureaucrats work in the spirit of public service rather than to have a comfortable life. And even interest groups that very often hold back their sectional demands for the greater good. People are not totally selfish. Of course, people are selfish, but by getting rid of all the other motivations, you're actually going to create more problems than you solve. Because once you begin to assume that everyone is out to steal from the government, everyone's out to blow up the budget state control, everyone's going to implement policies that will only increase their electoral chances, then you cannot run a society on that assumption. Also, the proponents of the government failure approach vastly understate the actual extent of market failure. Milton Friedman personally didn't talk about government failure per se, but when you read him and people like him, they basically say that markets work very well except for the provision of public goods and a few little things. No, it's not like that. We've seen how governments have grown because we have come to recognize that markets are failing all the time. If you begin to accept that free trade may not benefit everyone, if you begin to accept that free markets may not generate that full employment, if you begin to accept that financial markets are inherently unstable, then there are a lot more market failures than you think, and especially what these people argue.